Good to see everyone tonight. As you know, this quarter is ending this evening, but we're going to continue the parable class into the next quarter. So if you have enjoyed it and if you want to stay, we'd be pleased to have you here. And so we've been looking, as we've said, at the parables of Jesus. And tonight we're be turning to Luke 18. We'll be looking at the parable of two prayers. Now, you might also know this as the parable of the Pharisee and publican. But again, we're going to style it tonight, the parable of two prayers. Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. Here's what we're going to do this evening. We're going to read this parable together. And we won't be getting into it textually until next Wednesday night. But we want to read it. We want to remind ourselves what's going on. And then we'll open it up for some quick observation, some discussion. You know, what is it in this parable that really attracts our attention? This is one of the parables probably most notable. It's one that is very memorable because of the two characters in it. And of course, what they are doing, praying. And so we'll read it together. We'll open it up for some quick discussion, some insight. And then we're just going to make some points, foundational points, relative to this study, both tonight and also next Wednesday night. So begin with me in verse 9. It says, "Also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, 'God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess.' And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Now again, probably brings back fond memories of this story. We've all heard it on numerous occasions. Again, what is it? What is it about this parable that makes it so memorable to you? What is it that you want to make sure possibly next Wednesday night that we emphasize, because once again, you believe it's a weighty principle that we're dealing with. Any takers on this? Anyone have something from this parable that you want to mention, want to make a comment on? I know it's Wednesday night. I know it's a hard day. Sometimes on Wednesday night, we're just more content to sit and listen, and that's fine. But anyone have something that, again, just reading this parable has brought to your mind, your attention again? Brother Paul?
You know, one of them almost sounded like a fake. He's putting it out there like he's so this and so that, and the other one just really is kind of down to earth.
Okay. You know, as Paul says that, the contrast, we'll probably mention this sometime tonight, possibly next Wednesday night, we'll be looking specifically at Pharisees and at tax collectors or publicans. But as Brother Paul mentioned that, what a contrast here. The Pharisee was one that was well respected by the common people. And of course, many of them, as we see this example, thought very highly of themselves too. And contrast that with the tax collector, the publican. Very briefly, they were despised. They were considered traitors. The Jews hated paying tax to Rome. And when one of their own would benefit by being employed by Rome to collect taxes from his own, again, they would have nothing to do with that individual. Many times in the Bible, the tax collectors or the publicans were placed in the same category with the harlots. And that's their view concerning the tax collectors. They are absolutely worthless. In fact, that phrase, that word despised, it really means to view as nothing. And that's the way the Pharisees looked upon the tax collector. But you know, when you see this, again, as Brother Paul pointed out, here's one so full of himself that he prayed with himself. And here's one who is so contrite. He couldn't even lift his eyes to heaven. He smote himself on his breast. Again, that's a sign of contrition. It's a sign, you know, that we are very humble. And he just said, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. So the publican, he's asking for mercy. The Pharisee, he's talking about his merits. And isn't that interesting? Do we use prayer to tell God about our merits? Or do we use prayer, that wonderful avenue through Jesus Christ, to plead for mercy, what every one of us need? We have over here, Brother Elsie.
Why do you ask me? You've told everything. This man is, as you said, and as I was about to say, that he is full of himself. He came to pray to tell God how good he is, how much better he is than the other guy. They are opposite. One was justified, and the other one wasn't justified. But he's just full of himself.
Okay.
One who had looked up to God as if he's equal to God and prayed, and the other bowed his head down, the publican. It just, the Lord, when he shows us these things through parable, he makes it really plain, and it fits everyone. It fits me, and it fits everyone else. We have all been that Pharisees at one time, thought we were better than someone else.
Okay.
You know, not being humble as we should, but had our heads stuck up. We see it all the time, perhaps each Sunday.
Okay. You know, as Brother Elsie points that out, you know, one of the things about the Pharisees, they were religious show-offs. You go back and look at Matthew 6, and Jesus is teaching, do not be like them, Matthew 6 and verse 8. He's talking about when we give, don't sound that trumpet. When you fast, don't put on a gloomy face. And when you pray, don't use repetitions to be heard of men. And so as Brother Elsie points out, that's exactly what the Pharisee was doing. You know, you compare even the volume of their prayers. The Pharisees' prayer was about 5 times longer than the publicans, the tax collectors. And so he was there to be seen. And he wasn't there to exalt God. Really, you know, his prayer started off good. God, I thank you. He should have just stopped right there. And so, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, you know, adulterers, or like this tax collector. And so, you know, he wasn't there to exalt God. He was there ultimately to insult somebody else, pointing out that tax collector. And so we need to be very, very careful. You know, this idea of Phariseeism, elite, their very word means separatist. And that's what they were. They would withdraw themselves from everyone because they thought they were better than everyone. You know, that's part of what Jesus contended with many times in the parables. You know, in Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son, really the older brother represents the Jews, represents the Pharisees. Remember his attitude. Father, I have never neglected a commandment of yours, and you have never killed the fatted calf so I can be merry with my friends. He really thought that. I never neglected a command of yours. The prodigal, on the other hand, would represent, like this tonight, the tax collector. the one who has sinned and knows that they've sinned and is very saddened and heartbroken because of that sin. Well, remember when the parable began in Luke 15, remember what they said? This man receives sinners and eats with them. Luke 15 and verse 2. Jesus went on in that parable to say, you're right. You're right. I will receive sinners and I will eat with them because that's what my Father does. When the prodigal comes home, I'll receive the prodigal. When the tax collector approaches my throne this humbly, I'll receive him. But on the other hand, when the elder brother, I've never neglected a command of yours. When the Pharisee here, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. I'm not like other men. Well, he should have been more like that tax collector. And so it is sad when we see these two men in such vivid contrast. And again, the one thinking he's fine, the one thinking he's okay, because he's evaluated himself, and because he is in awe of himself, he thinks he's the one that will be justified. Anybody else have anything to share with us concerning what's going on in this parable? You know, if it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable, wouldn't it, to see what we find here? Anybody else? Brother Tyler.
I've heard it said before that, whenever we get to heaven, we're going to see a lot of people there who we didn't expect to see, and a lot of people there who we, didn't think would make it, if you will. But I think really this parable shows the fact that if we're judging on the surface, then, a lot of times we'll be wrong because God looks at the heart.
Okay, very good observation. Remember 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7? God doesn't see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. And so God examined these. We'll mention this in a moment, but both of these men examined themselves. And of course, the Pharisees, the result of that examination was, man, I am so good. I'm so much better than everybody else, than other men. And the tax collector's evaluation was, be merciful to me, a sinner. You know, in the original language, that phrase, a sinner, it really means the sinner. I am the sinner. It's sort of like Paul. Remember, Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and really Paul shows us both sides of this. He's both of these. He's that Pharisee who thought he had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, Acts 26 and verse 9, so full of himself. In Philippians 3, he says, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. And he's showing the Jews that whatever credentials they could put forth, he could match them and exceed them. But his point in Philippians 3 is, that's all rubbish now. I used to put so much importance on that, but that's all rubbish to gain Christ, to know Christ. And so, again, when you look at this, he at one time was a Pharisee, but remember what he says in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 15? It's a lot like this tax collector. God be merciful to me, a sinner, the sinner. Paul says, that he was the chief of sinners. 1 Timothy 1 and verse 15. And so we see this contrast. Is that Brother Elsie again?
Yes, that first verse there, 9 there. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves. That was the problem. The Pharisees trust in themselves. The publicans trust in God.
Yeah.
They were opposite.
Okay.
He trusted in God that God would do that which was right.
Okay. Elsie mentioned this verse right here. This is the reason why Jesus taught this parable. Okay? Because some trusted in themselves, what? That they were righteous. You remember Romans 3 and verse 10? There is none righteous, no, not one. How can somebody trust in themselves that they were righteous when there's none righteous, no, not one? of our own righteousness. Remember, I think it's Isaiah. I always get this transposed. It's either Isaiah 64 and verse 6 or 66 and verse 4, you know. But in this context, it talks about all of our righteousness is like filthy rags. We have no righteousness to appear before God. Our righteousness is the righteousness of Jesus Christ. You know, that's our righteousness, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. And so it's so sad when we trust in ourselves. He trusted in himself, and he was totally wrong. He who trusts in his own heart is a fool. Proverbs 28 and verse 26. And so that's what the man did, and that's what the man was, trusting in himself. Now, anything else? Anything else before we just mention some things? Look at this poem. I found it. I wanted to share it because it's talking about what we're reading tonight. Okay, this parable of two prayers, this parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Read it with me. Two men went to pray, or rather say one went to brag, the other to pray. One stands up close and treads on high, where the other dares not send his eye. One nearer to God's altar trod, the other to the altar's God. You know, notice that. One nearer to God's altar trod. They're in the temple. They're in the temple. And so the Pharisee, he's the one nearer to God's altar, but the other to the altar's God. Again, it's like the prodigal. All he wanted was the Father. And all this publican, this tax collector wanted was mercy. Not to talk about his merits. He had no merits, and he knew he had no merits. And so it's not merits he's referring to. It's simply mercy. Be merciful to me, the sinner. Well, notice this, an introductory point. And really, I've got several statements here, but they all go back really to one point. Read this with me. There is obviously a connection between this parable, Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, and the one taught earlier in this chapter, Luke 18, verses 1 through 8. Now, in a moment, we're going to read that one, the one first. And another time in this class, we'll look at that one specifically. But right now, just notice this. There is a connection between these two. Both parables deal with the same subject, prayer. And so look at this with me. And before I start reading in Luke 18, verse 1, think about this. When Elsie pointed us to verse 9, that Jesus, he taught the parable because some trusted in themselves that they were righteous. You know, we don't know. We don't know if he's just talking to some in the crowd that he knows. Jesus knew what was in man. John 2, verses 24 and 25. Was this just the crowd that he knew? Was it his own disciples who at times had problems and he was trying to guide them? They would often quarrel about which one of them was the greatest. So maybe it's his own disciples that he's trying to get a point across to. Maybe it is the Pharisees. He's going to use the Pharisee as an example to those who trust in themselves that they are righteous. But again, he's dealing with prayer. Both of these subjects dealing with prayer. Now, read this with me, the first one. We're just going to read it, make a couple of points. Look what it says, Luke 18, verse 1. It says, "Then he spoke a parable to them, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God, nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, Get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, Though I do not fear God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? So notice they're both talking about prayer. Jesus taught this parable that we just read so that men might always pray and not lose heart. And so think about this. I think this is a very important, valid point. In the first, talking about this first parable, the lesson taught is one of boldness and persistence. That's what Jesus is getting across in Luke 18, verses 1 through 8. He is teaching them that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. Here's a widow. She has no one to go to but that unrighteous judge. She keeps going, she keeps going, she keeps going. The man does not answer her request because he cares about God, because he loves humanity. He only answers it because lest by her continual coming she wear me out. I don't want to keep putting up with her, so I'm going to answer it. She was persistent. Some translations, importunity. Big word that just means persistent in solicitation. This lady was not about to stop coming to him. He's the only one that could help her. So the first parable taught about boldness. Remember Hebrews 4:16? We are to approach God's throne of grace boldly. That's what she did. She's a widow. She is, quote unquote, a nobody in his eyes. But she boldly approaches him. She persistently comes until he grants her request. And so the first one, boldness and persistence. In the second, we learn that something more is required if our prayers are to be answered. There's something more than boldness. There's something more than persistence. And again, really, if that boldness and persistence is not tempered, if it's not balanced, it can end up being the very reason why God doesn't hear our prayer, why he doesn't listen to us. Boldness does not mean we come before him in a brazen fashion. It doesn't mean we come before him demanding anything. And so you look at both of these parables. Look at this right here. Alongside our boldness and persistence, we bring humility and reverence. That's what this second one is showing us. Oh yeah, you be bold, and yes, in your prayer life, you be persistent, but you better temper that with, once again, humility, meekness, lowliness of heart, and reverence. Thus, when we view these together, the result is a very healthy and balanced attitude in prayer. The balance is being bold yet reverent, persistent yet humble. We're not coming before God's throne demanding. We're not acting like we, as his child, are his only child, a very spoiled child, telling God the Father what we want as his child. No, we're not like that at all. And so the first, Luke 18, 1 through 8, helps us become as a child. Remember, we're taught in Matthew 18 and verse 3 to become like children. Except you be converted and become as a little child, you will no way enter the kingdom of heaven. We're to become like children. When children have needs, they go to their mother, they go to their father. They're persistent. So the first one teaches us to become as a child in that regard. The second one, Luke 18, 9 through 14, helps us grow up and mature in our prayer life. Yes, we come as children. We come boldly, we come persistently, but as newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word that you might grow with respect to salvation. We're not always coming as a babe. We're not always coming as a child. Again, childlike, but not childish. We put away childish things, don't we? 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. And 2 Peter 3 and verse 18. You know, we grow in the grace and in the knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So there is that childlike faith, and there is that maturity that continues to grow. There is that childlike quality of boldly asking the Father, persistently asking the Father, but there is that, again, maturity that humbly comes and reverently comes before the Father. Now look at these similarities. Both men went to the temple. You know, in what I have read in times past and even this week, and think about this now, this goes back with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were notable for putting out people from the synagogue. They didn't want tax collectors in their synagogue. For this tax collector to come at all to the temple, that's pretty amazing. He's going to be viewed with scorn. He's going to be looked down with contempt. He's going to be despised. What is that man doing here in the first place? They both went to the temple. Again, I always go back to the prodigal son, but you remember, I'm sure the elder brother thought, what right does this young brother of mine have to come home? He's left the father's house. He took the share of the inheritance. He squandered it with loose living, riotous living. What right does he have to come back in the first place? But they both go to the temple. The Pharisee thinks he belongs there. The publican, the tax collector, he's not so sure, is he? Again, both went to pray. Obvious, because that's what this parable is about. Both of their prayers. So they're in the temple. They're both praying. Both stood while praying. You know, from what I can tell, there are two words used, different words in this parable about standing. Yeah, the one is more egotistical. It's the Pharisee as he stood. He stood because he wanted to be seen. Now, standing was the typical posture of prayer, okay? And they both stood. But remember, the other one stood afar off. He doesn't have the right in his mind to even be here. And the Pharisee wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. He wanted others to hear him, even as he insulted the tax collector. How sad it is when we delight in putting someone else down. But both stood while praying. Both examined themselves. Now, I mentioned this earlier. And think about this. We're taught to examine ourselves. You remember Haggai 1 and verse 5, consider your ways. You remember Lamentation 3 and verse 40, let us examine and probe our ways, and let us return again to our God. We're taught to examine ourselves. Test yourselves to see whether you be in the faith. 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. They both did this. Now remember, the Pharisee, when he examined himself, he was delighted. And there was nobody better to examine. Nobody can match him. Nobody is like him. I'm so thankful that I'm not like, the rest. I'm so thankful that I'm head and shoulders above everybody. And again, the tax collector examined himself, wasn't delighted in what he found at all. Humbled, contrite, mourning, sorrowful. Again, both offered a prayer based upon the result of their self-evaluation. Now, they both examined themselves, and then after that examination, they both offered a prayer based upon that. Again, what was the Pharisee's conclusion? I'm great. I am so good. God, you should be so thankful to have me as a servant. You don't have anybody else that compares with me. It's different, like in the book of Job. When God says that about an individual, God told Satan, have you considered my servant Job? I have no one like him on the face of the earth. But it's totally different when that's my conclusion. God doesn't have anyone like me on the face of this earth. Well, that's the Pharisee. And so after his self-evaluation, he offers, if you can even call it that, he offers, quote unquote, a prayer. And again, the self-evaluation of the tax collector. It caused him simply to say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Think about this. Both went down to their house justified. Now you say, well, Ken, you must not have heard the last verse. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. Both of these men went down to their house justified. Remember, the difference is the Pharisee, he went down having justified himself. You remember Luke 10 and verse 29? Luke 10 and verse 29. Turn over there. We've already looked at this by way of the Good Samaritan. This is what prompted Jesus' teaching here, because remember what the lawyer had asked? Look at Luke 10 and verse 29. Look what it says here, and this is the problem with the Pharisee. Luke 10 verse 29, it says, but wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Wishing to justify himself. Oh, the Pharisee went home justified not by God. No, not by God. But he had justified himself. There's absolutely no one like me. Righteous, self-righteous. Turn, I think it's Luke 16. It's interesting, Luke deals with this quite a bit. Turn to Luke 16. Look, if you will, at verse 15. Luke 16 and verse 15, this is the verse. Notice what it says. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves. Now stop here. Stop here. Look at verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all these things, and they derided him. Talking about Jesus. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your heart. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. So, the Pharisee, he went home justified, not in the same sense, in the same context of the tax collector, but he had justified himself. He'd examined himself, found no one better than himself, justified himself, and I'm sure went on his way merrily. But again, the other one, the tax collector, he went home justified by God. Like Bill said, that's all that matters. At the close of the day, I want to be justified, but I understand to justify myself is worthless. It's meaningless. It means nothing. To be justified by God, that's what is precious and valuable. Now, look at this, differences. Two men, but as different as night and day. Again, so many times Jesus will use a story with two sons. He said, son, go work today in my vineyard. One says, I will, but didn't. The other one says, I won't, but did. The two men here. And you can't get these two contrasts farther apart than a Pharisee and a publican, a tax collector. Different as night and day. Two prayers, but as far apart as the east from the west. You can't get a greater distance between these two prayers. Again, however you want to judge these prayers, by way of volume, the Pharisee spoke many words as compared to the tax collector. And what has Jesus taught? Don't use vain repetitions. Don't just keep saying what you're saying over and over to be heard of men. Well, that's what the Pharisee wanted. He wanted people to hear him. He wanted to attract attention. He had something to say. He was going to boast. He was going to brag. And then he was going to do a little bit of insulting too for someone else there. Two prayers, but as far apart as the east from the west. And notice, two outcomes with absolutely nothing in common. Now remember, we said they both went down to their house justified. Sounds like they have a lot in common. Absolutely nothing. One justified himself. The other was justified by God Almighty. by Jesus the Christ. It's interesting, too, when you go back and look at what Jesus says in verse 14 of Luke 18, and you compare it to Luke 14 and verse 11, where Jesus ends his teaching there, it's the same thing. The one who humbles himself will be exalted. The one who exalts himself will be humbled. The same thing he uses, to end those parables. Now, next Wednesday, Lord willing, we're going to start with background. And what we mean by background, we're just going to give a quick background for Pharisees. Who were these people? What were they all about? And then a quick background for tax collectors or publicans. Please understand this. This is not a condemnation for all Pharisees. That's not what Jesus intended it for. Nor is this a justification for all tax collectors. That's taking this parable way too far. You know, when you think about this, as I said, Paul was a Pharisee. He's a good man. Nicodemus, when he came by night, he's a Pharisee. Joseph of Arimathea, he's a Pharisee. It wasn't all Pharisees who were bad, nor was it all tax collectors who were good. But think about this. Matthew, also known as Levi, he was a tax collector. Jesus called him to be one of the apostles. And Zacchaeus in Luke 19, he was the chief tax collector. And remember, a good man, because he says, you know, if I've taken too much, he said, I'll restore it fourfold. So don't ever think when you're looking at this, it's just like saying all Samaritans would stop and help, and no priest and Levites would help a person. That's not what Jesus is doing. He's using the underdog, as Tyler said, to show the very one at time we think will gain God's justification doesn't. Why? Because there's a heart problem. There's an ego problem. There's a pride problem. And again, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16 and verse 18. So just look at that. Look at Pharisees, be thinking about them. Look at tax collectors, be thinking about them. And we'll begin on that basis. Then we'll go through textually, and we'll look again at what Jesus said. We'll take much more time next Wednesday night. And then, time permitting, we'll talk about some lessons. Lessons learned. And that's what this class is all about. We have to learn the lessons that Jesus intended. We just mentioned one that Jesus never intended. If we come out of here and say all Pharisees were bad and all tax collectors were justified, then we have, quote, learned a lesson that Jesus never intended us to learn. So your plate's full. You got a lot of homework. Do some research. Do some looking at Pharisees and tax collectors. Read this text. Ponder it. Meditate upon it. And likewise, think about lessons learned. And more than anything, let's, put ourselves and say, where do I fit in this story? Which one am I more like? Am I like that Pharisee? Or am I more like that tax collector? Some humility, some reverence. Appreciate your comments very, very much tonight. Appreciate your presence. Good to see everyone who's with us.